Howdy folks, Justin here. Today we are going to look at the prophecy mechanic in Elder Scrolls Legends, starting with a brief overview of how it works for people who are a little more unfamiliar with the game itself, and then a look at each card with prophecy and tips to minimize the impact it's going to have on you if you trigger it. So, prophecy is obviously one of the things that makes Elder Scrolls Legends unique. That and the rune mechanic and the lanes mechanics are sort of the defining characteristics of the game. And the prophecy mechanic is integrally tied to the rune mechanic. Rune mechanics, every time you take 5 damage, you break a rune, you draw a card, and then if it has prophecy, you get to play it for free if you'd like. You don't have to. I didn't know this for the first couple weeks I was playing. If a prophecy triggers and it's in that little floaty glowing area on the screen, you can drag it to your hand or just wait for the timer to count down, and then it'll end up in your hand. But when you break one of these runes and trigger a prophecy, you can really swing the game in your favor, or start to try to make a comeback, or prevent lethal, or even trigger lethal if you get lucky with the right card. So we're going to start by looking at red. Right? Red has 4 prophecy cards, the lowest number of any of the colors. Sorry, and they're all fairly aggressive creatures. We'll get to the last one, the Grotwood Ambusher, last, but for the most part, these fit into a tempo or an aggro strategy. Right? Sharpshooter Scout sees some play in Archer decks and sees some play in Crusader decks. That's pretty much it. I don't know that it's really all that popular in Battle Mage decks. I believe they have better options for pinging and stuff like that. But Sharpshooter Scout's a pretty cheap creature. Summon Prophecy, summon, deal 1 damage, right, for a 1/1. This card sees minimal play even in those archetypes. And it's not really a card you need to worry too much about triggering. When you are facing against Archer, which is the most likely place to see this card, be aware that when breaking an opposing rune, pushing for lethal, you're going to want to swing with a creature with 1 toughness first, I guess. But beyond that, this is not a card that you really need to be too cognizant of when making attacks and breaking runes. Greystone Ravager, one of the most aggressively costed creatures in the game, for a 2-drop at least. 4/1 Prophecy, no other text. It is an Orc, which is worth remembering. This card sees play in some Orc decks, although not all, some Crusader decks, although not all, and some Battle Mage decks. Never seen this card in Archer. I suppose you could see it in Mono Red. To be fair, I played it in my Mono Red deck when I hit Legend with Mono Red last season. But Greystone Ravager is a card that, if you're at a low life total and you're not going to kill your opponent next turn, and you suspect they might be running Ravager, you should be very careful to make sure you have either a guard or a removal spell that you can throw down into a lane where your opponent will put the Ravager after you break those runes. Primarily, this card is going to be found in Crusader and Battle Mage, like I said. So just make sure that when pushing for lethal, if at all possible, hold like a Crushing Blow or a Firebolt or a small guard creature in hand, so that when this guy gets triggered, you can put it down somewhere to prevent the snapback lethal that your opponent's going to get on board. Cast Out. Cast Out sees very little play. I've been experimenting with it in Battle Mage. It's just a pure tempo card. It's card disadvantage in that you're playing something, your opponent's going to still retain control of that card even if it is in their hand now. But it's interesting as a prophecy card because it's like Red's only real comeback mechanic, prophecy. Sharpshooter Scout has some niche applications, and Grotwood Ambusher might trigger a blowout against a tokens deck without a Divine Fervor in play, perhaps. But for the most part, Cast Out is pretty unique amongst prophecy cards in Red. It's a pretty unpopular, underplayed card right now. It's worth pointing out that, for what it's worth, you can return a creature you control to your hand. Red is the home of a lot of charge creatures, so if you have this in hand or in your deck and you feel like you want to swing again with a charge creature for lethal, you have that opportunity if you have Cast Out. I wouldn't recommend worrying too much about ever playing around Cast Out. The only deck I've ever seen it in is Battle Mage, and if you're playing around Cast Out, you're probably playing around Lightning Bolt too, and you really should be much more worried about Lightning Bolt. Cast Out is just going to be an inconvenience for the most part. The only thing I would say is that if you suspect your opponent of running Cast Out, or you saw them play a Cast Out, make sure that you attack before you play any guards. So if your opponent's got some lethal on board and they return the guard creature you have to your hand, you can just throw it back down again. Not a lot to say about Cast Out. Not a lot to say about any of these Red Prophecy cards, to be honest, because they don't see a lot of play. Grotwood Ambusher is a card that I experimented with in Archer a few months ago. Doing 1 damage to all enemy creatures in the lane as opposed to the Pyromancer that does 1 damage to all creatures in the lane. I would probably say it's not worth the extra 2 magic cost on the card. But I don't believe I've ever triggered this as a prophecy. If Spellsword Tokens becomes the meta, or if Battle Mage becomes the meta, maybe you'd want to throw a couple of these in your deck. If you suspect your opponent of playing this, pat yourself on the back for your victory, I guess. No, honestly, I wouldn't worry about ever playing around Grotwood Ambusher. It's not a card you need to worry about. The next color we're going to get to, though, however, Blue Intelligence, has some prophecy cards that see a lot of play, and so we need to, think a little bit more about what these are going to do to you. Shrieking Harpy has seen a rise in play lately in mage decks. It sees quite a bit of play in assassin decks as well, and I have seen it played in battle mage decks, in tempo-oriented battle mage decks. Shrieking Harpy is a card that can really screw up your combat math, right? If you suspect your opponent is playing Shrieking Harpy, you're going to want to swing with your largest creature first and break the most runes if you're pushing for lethal. Not necessarily the route you always want to take, and it's worth pointing out, not always the best strategy against a deck you think might run Lightning Bolt, because if you trigger a Lightning Bolt with your giant creature that is immune to Lightning Bolt, your smaller creature, which you might need for that lethal, is going to be Lightning Boltable. But playing around Shrieking Harpy in the early game is sort of impossible. If you're running cards, small creatures with lethal, like Fighters Guild Recruit or Deadly Draugr, consider keeping those back and swinging last with them, even if it makes more sense rune-breaking math-wise, so that you can trade into the Harpy and keep your large power creature, small toughness creature alive in the snapback that the Harpy's going to throw at you. Wisdom of the Ancients, don't worry about playing around this card. It's garbage, and if your opponent's running it, you're going to win. That's really all I have to say about that. I wouldn't even worry about playing around it in Arena. Theoretically, there are situations where this card could lead to a complete and utter blowout. However, the random nature of the card, and along with the fact that no one plays it, means that it's sort of just a waste of your time to worry about. Camelorn Sentinel sees play in some mage decks. That's about the only place I see it. And this guy can really put a hurt on some aggro decks. You can't really. So when let's say you're breaking the first rune, it's turn 3 or 4, and you've got a couple creatures with 2 or less toughness in one lane. Playing around Camelorn Sentinel can be tricky. The best strategy I would recommend for playing around Camelorn Sentinel would be to, if you're playing against a mage deck you suspect of running it, position your creatures on. Don't pile them into one lane. As tempting as it may be with cards like Orc Clan Chieftain, spread them out a little bit, diversify where you're putting your threats, and that's a good strategy for playing around both Camelorn Sentinel and Firestorm, the next card. Firestorm sees some play in mage decks. I have seen it in sorcerer decks as well. And the same ways to play around Camelorn Sentinel sort of apply to Firestorm. In addition, if Firestorm becomes more popular, you're going to want to take a look at, instead of, say, Hist Speaker in a scout deck, which is a 2/2, take a look at Dragonborn Savior, the 2/3. Or Dragon Tail Savior, sorry. Playing around Firestorm involves the same sort of splitting between a lane strategy as Camelorn Sentinel, but it could also, if it becomes more popular, be the sort of thing you could just shift your deck around slightly to accommodate. Lightning Bolt, this is the prophecy card that probably produces more posts on the official official Bethesda forums than any other prophecy card. This one has a few specific things I'm going to mention. Obviously, there's a few important basic rules to trying to play around Lightning Bolt. First of all, if you're pushing for lethal, swing with your creatures first that die to Lightning Bolt. Secondly, in any situation where it is possible, if you're at 4 or below life, gain life before you swing, even if that means doing things like sacrificing your house kinsman before you break a rune, by filling up the lane and then dropping an additional creature and choosing it to sacrifice. Playing a Moonlight Werebat and swinging with it beforehand. Even playing a healing potion from your hand before combat, Make sure you're aware, and this is a card that's in every blue deck, right? So when you're playing against blue pushing lethal under 5 life, do your best. Sometimes you can't help it and you need to just hope to get lucky, in which case the best strategy is to break as few runes as possible. If you have a 6-power creature on the board, get him to 6 before you break that last rune, so that's one prophecy trigger you can try to avoid. It's basically all there is to say about Lightning Bolt. Great, powerful card. Fate Weaver, a card that I have to admit I've been surprised to see played as much as it has been lately. It's popular in the Assassin deck. It is popular in Mage decks. It's not a card that I thought was going to see a lot of play because I sort of underappreciated Prophecy for a long time. I thought, I'm not going to run any cards because they have Prophecy. I'm going to run cards that incidentally have Prophecy, and this turned out to not be the best strategy as the competitive Legend scene has begun to develop. Fate Weaver is not a card you need to necessarily worry about playing around at all, in the sense that only on a turn where you're not attacking for lethal and you're at a super low life total do you need to worry about what it does. It can, of course, trigger other Prophecy cards, but then the same kind of rules apply, or same principles apply to playing around Prophecy cards in general. Fate Weaver is an interesting card. Obviously, there's a point at which a critical mass of Prophecy cards could be printed for this game where Fate Weaver would just get completely bonkers. But we're not there yet, although some of the decks are getting as close as they can get with the current card pool. Fate Weaver is a card that sees quite a bit of play, but I would say don't worry about playing around Fate Weaver necessarily, so much as worrying around the other cards with Prophecy that your opponent might have in their deck. Let's move on to Willpower. Willpower's got some pretty simple ones, pretty straightforward, powerful effects. Healing Potion. This is the card that used to see a lot of play in Action Mage, now sees play in some Control Mage decks, although it's not in all of them anymore. And I've also seen played in Control Spell Sword decks. And it's worth pointing out, it sees some play in Fringe Monk decks trying to use the Spriggan guy who gains attack every time you gain health. Healing Potions is not a card that you necessarily want to spend too much time thinking about how to play around. It can prevent you from having lethal if it's a close one. Most of the time, if you see your opponent trigger a Prophecy and they drag it to their hand and they're above 20 life or so, it's a good sign that it's Healing Potion. The other one that I would think that you would need to concern yourself with in that case would be Piercing Javelin or Lightning Bolt. There might not be a target that they deem worthy of destroying on the board at the time. But keep in mind that if your opponent does drag a card to their hand and they're playing Willpower, that there's a really good chance it's Healing Potion. Because obviously your opponent has a certain amount of incentive to, especially with the cushion of safety, knowing they have a Healing Potion in hand, want to draw some extra cards from having their runes broken before they start chugging back up on the life. Playing around Healing Potion when pushing lethal is virtually impossible, and playing around it in general is sort of not something you need to concern yourself with. It's just one of those prophecies that you can't really do anything about. It's not going to affect the board necessarily, but it will sometimes ruin your day. And it's not an extremely powerful card, and it's not even running all the decks that could benefit from it because of that. But something to be aware of when calculating lethal. Keep in mind this might not work because Healing Potion. Priest of the Moons sees no play in on the ladder. I wouldn't worry about playing around it. If it was in any deck, it would be in a Monk control deck or a Monk combo deck with the Spriggan guy. It's not a bad card necessarily. I can imagine a Crusader deck that's exploiting Golden Saint and Triumphant Jarl potentially running this card. I wouldn't worry about it. I wouldn't worry about it in Arena too much either, except in as much as you would worry about your opponent triggering any small creature if you expect a crackback to kill you. Two Moons Contemplation. Why is this This card comes up when you search for Prophecy because it summons Priests of the Moons, which have Prophecy, so don't worry about this card. I like this card, but it's not great. Cloudress Illusionist, I've seen this card played occasionally in decks that run Execute and Aerostorm. Not a card you need to worry about playing around on the ladder right now. Not a bad card, certainly. A 4/3 with Prophecy is one of the more powerful creatures that you can have that has Prophecy. But it doesn't see a lot of play. Wouldn't worry about playing around it. Maybe a Crusader control deck is playing this card. That's the only time I would even imagine seeing it, but don't sweat it. In Arena, not a lot you can do about this card, and playing around it is going to take more resources intellectually than is worth expending on that sort of thing. Loyal Housecarl, I've seen this card played in some Crusader decks. Sort of a mix between a pump effect and a defensive tool, if that's the direction the game is heading, which is something the Crusader decks sort of have a little bit of flexibility on if they're built in that manner. This is a card that you really don't need to worry playing around too much, but if you suspect your opponent of running it and your opponent, or you've seen your opponent running it, my suggestion would be to sort of look at it the same way you would look at Lightning Bolt, right? Swing with creatures, except in reverse. You swing with creatures first I'm speaking too quickly. Look at it like you look at Lightning Bolt, for the most part, as far as calculating combat math. But don't forget, too, to remember the trick we talked about with saving lethal creatures. Throwing a lethal creature into this obviously feels great. A 1/1 with lethal, killing a 5 magic Prophecy card is pretty satisfying. The bottom line is, keep your breakthrough creatures back, especially ones that have more than 4 toughness. And other than that, don't sweat it too much. Your opponent's not going to be playing this card. Piercing Javelin, sort of the opposite school of thought. This is what I was trying to say earlier with Loyal Housecarl, and I got distracted. Piercing Javelin is sort of the opposite sort of thought of Lightning Bolt, where you want to swing with your largest creatures first. Not the cards, not with Lightning Bolt, you swing with the creatures that are largest last, so they don't die Lightning Bolt. When you're playing around Piercing Javelin, you want to swing with your largest creatures first. If you have a 7/7 and you attack and you break 2 runes and you trigger a Piercing Javelin, and then you have a board full of 1/1s or 2/2s or something like that, feels bad for your opponent, and unless you have lethal on board with those 2/2s, they're going to be really tempted to Piercing Javelin the enormous creature anyway. So, playing around Piercing Javelin, attack with the big guys first. Playing around Lightning Bolt or Loyal Housecarl, swing with the big guys last. Moving on to green. Green has the most Prophecy cards, it would appear. I recently soul trapped all of my Black Sack Protectors, the original version, because I like this one so much more. Daring Cutpurse didn't always have Prophecy. Prophecy was added to this card not too long ago. Not a card that you need to worry about playing around, except in the same situations where we talked about before with small creatures. The Greystone Ravager, I believe it's called, the red one. Concern yourself with Daring Cutpurse, because Daring Cutpurse is in a lot of green decks. It's in the Assassin decks, it's in Scout decks now, it's in Monk decks, it's in Archer decks. That's all of the green decks. Concern yourself with Daring Cutpurse in the sense that if you're trying to race your opponent, you should have, if possible, a backup plan if your opponent triggers one of these cards. Beyond that, your best way to deal with Daring Cutpurse Prophecy triggers is to be ahead on life and to be racing. So the same sort of things apply to Daring Cutpurse, like I said, that apply to other small creatures that don't have guard. Those are a different sort of barrel of fish. Barrel of Monkeys, kettle of fish. Kettle of Khajiit. Dunestalker. This card's been seeing more play lately, which makes me happy. Lane-changing creatures are super exciting. If you saw my video that I posted yesterday with the game versus Monk, you'll see that my opponent was shifting lanes back and forth all the time. I love that sort of gameplay because I love anything that sets Legends apart. It makes it sort of unique. When playing around Dunestalker, this is some... you have a couple options, right? If you're taking the defensive position against deck-running cards like Dunestalker, your best bet is to guard up different lanes. Never try to abandon a lane, even if it feels like you're sort of wasting your time by throwing a small creature into one lane when you could contest something in another lane. Having creatures in both lanes is the best way to play around cards like Dunestalker. If you suspect your opponent of running cards like Dunestalker, I would strongly encourage you to prioritize removing opposing creatures to a degree that you ordinarily wouldn't. You can race a lot of aggro decks, but decks running Dunestalker, if part of your racing strategy involves larger creatures that have guard, you might not be able to pull off what you're trying to do, and so it might be better to take a slow approach if you suspect your opponent of running cards like Dunestalker, removing threats piecemeal, and then pushing for a kill at the end of the game. I feel like that's one of the best ways to deal with cards like Dunestalker. Really cool card. Fighters Guild Recruit, we've all seen this card played a million times. It's in every deck that can play it. Because it's a great card, it's in every arena deck that can play it, because it's a common. Playing around Fighters Guild Recruit is sort of really kind of depends on what your deck is trying to do, right? Like if you're playing an aggro deck, playing around cards like Fighters Guild Recruit is sort of the same sort of thing that you're going to, involves employing the same strategy that playing around any other guard creature would, like the Camelorn Sentinel when we talked about that. Putting threats in both lanes, making sure that if you have a high-value creature like a Relentless Raider, this has happened to me a number of times, you might be able to tell, you put another small 2-power creature in the same lane so that you can throw that into the Fighters Guild Recruit. Having a high-value card next to a buddy who can throw himself into this Argonian Recruit. Funny, Argonian Recruit is a token created by Black Marsh Warden, but having a friend along to keep your high-value creatures alive is basically the best way to play around this, aside from putting your creatures in both lanes. Now, if you're playing a deck with fewer threats and they're large creatures that you invest a lot of time and magicka into, playing around Fighters Guild Recruit is a little different. Your best bet is to hold on to small removal spells, Firebolt, Crushing Blow. Even cards like Murkwater Witch, the 2 magicka 1/1 with guard that gives a creature -1/-1. Holding on to cards like that can be essential to making sure that you don't lose your big investment to your opponent's tiny little annoying Prophecy, Guard, and lethal creature. I think Fighters Guild Recruit's a good example of a Prophecy card that doesn't really swing games one way or the other, but adds an additional layer of complexity. And you should play around this card every time you're playing a green deck, because it's good enough that it's in every green deck, but it's not game-breaking. It's just really good at what it does. Black Sap Protector's a card that didn't see play for quite a while. Saw a rise in popularity recently in the Assassin decks, and it's now being run in at least my Scout deck. I like this card quite a bit. It trades fairly favorably with the early cards that you see out of Archer, which is part of the reason I think this card has gained in popularity. And like I've talked about in previous videos, 3 attack is a really important number in this game because it allows you to trade into things like Moonlight Werebat, 5th Legion Trainer, a whole bunch of cards. 3 is a very important attack number to have. Black Sap Protector is pretty straightforward. You play around it the same way you would play around most guard creatures. If you have a high-value card that you don't want to slam into it, and you suspect your opponent of running Black Sap Protector, you can do things like have a friend along that you don't mind getting killed, like a Dunestalker, or you can hold on to a Crushing Blow, which is a good answer to this sort of thing. Yeah, playing around Black Sap Protector is fairly straightforward. It's a fairly straightforward card. Reasonable stats for its cost. It's on the border of cards that you run because they have Prophecy and just because they're really, they're playable. But I like seeing this card played. I feel like it's one of those cards, as soon as we have a more diverse card pool, we'll stop seeing so much play, but that's the strategy there. Now, Moonlight Werebat is an incredibly powerful card. I started running this a little over a month and a half maybe ago in my Scout deck, and this is one of the Prophecy cards that really can completely break the direction of the game, of your individual game. Gaining life, especially 4 life, it's not like Magic the Gathering, right? Where for a long time people talked about any cards that gain life as sort of a waste of time, right? There's a certain appeal to them when you're a new player and you're playing with Healing Hands, or I'm not sure that's a Legends card. Healing Salve, there we go. And you gain 3 life at the end of your opponent's turn or during your main phase or whatever because you're new to the game, and you think, well, now I'm at 23, like, if making my opponent go down in life is winning, isn't making my life going up winning too? And so I have to admit, when I first started playing Legends, I kind of was on that train where it's like, well, Drain is a stat that I place no value on, and I'm not going to concern myself with it. However, in Legends, the Drain cards, some of them anyway, including Moonlight Werebat, are well enough statted that gaining that life can just be completely backbreaking to certain strategies. I'm thinking in particular against the aggro strategies that Crusader, Battle Mage, and the really aggressive Archer decks can throw at you. In addition, because you're drawing extra cards and you're taking damage, if you break a rune or two in the beginning of the game and then you throw down a Drain creature and you start getting that life back, you're at a tremendously powerful advantage because you not only have more cards than your opponent, you also have more life than your opponent. Moonlight Werebat is, I would argue, probably the strongest Prophecy card in the game. You could make the case for Lightning Bolt and for Piercing Javelin, but I feel like Moonlight Werebat is much more likely to swing the game around than any of those other cards. It's also playable on its own. I mean, turn 4 or turn 3 with a Magic Elixir dropping this guy down, there are draws that a lot of opposing decks can have that can't answer that very well. I'm not going to say that it's too powerful, but I am uncomfortable with its power level. It's everywhere, and it makes sense because it's a good card. To play around Moonlight Werebat, more so than I think almost any of these other Prophecy cards, especially if you're the aggressor, you need to have an answer in hand to this, whether it be a Fighter's Guild recruit that you can throw down in that lane, or a Crushing Blow, a Lightning Bolt, a Piercing Javelin, because this will swing the direction of the game so quickly if your opponent gets even one swing in it potentially, and definitely two swings in with it. Moonlight Werebat can best be countered as you're attacking by pushing lethal on one turn. That's one option you have available to you. This is sort of an interesting way to look at this. If most of your creatures are in the Shadow Lane because you're playing an aggressive deck, you can counter a Moonlight Werebat play if you're not pushing lethal against your opponent by holding on to a charge creature that can do 3 damage. I say this because if your opponent's not in danger of dying in the next turn or two, it's going to be very tempting for your opponent to take the slightly greedy route and throw their Moonlight Werebat into a lane unopposed. You can answer that, and that unopposed lane, if you're playing an aggressive deck, is frequently going to be the field lane. So a good way to counter that is to have a charge creature in hand that you can throw into it. And it's more likely, oftentimes, that Crusader, especially I would imagine, has a charge creature available to them than it is that they have a removal spell they want to spend on a Moonlight Werebat. Ransack, to be honest, I kind of feel like this is a bit of a joke of a card, and it's an indication of something that's kind of scary about the game, which is that I've talked about this before, critical mass of Prophecy cards, at which point I feel like the game stops being as fun and Prophecy stops being as interesting. It's not, I mean, this is Lightning Helix that costs 3 times more, right, for people who play Magic the Gathering. I have to admit, I never thought this card would see standard play. I laughed about it a lot. When it triggers off of a Prophecy, it can feel real bad. The best way to play around this is basically the same way you play around Lightning Bolt, except with a little bit different combat math. I would expect to see Ransack most in Assassin decks, potentially in Monk decks. That's really it. I don't think you're going to see this in Archer. It's unless you get really lucky with the Prophecy trigger, it's pretty bad tempo. And I would not imagine that you see this deck in any Scout deck, or see this card in any Scout decks, so I wouldn't worry about it in those matchups. It does, if you believe your opponent's running Ransack, make sure before you do your combat math that you account for potentially a huge swing. If you have a 9/3 creature, or let's say you have a Boglurk or a 9/1 creature, and your plan is to attack with it last because you're going to put your opponent to 9, and you think your opponent's running Prophecy, you probably have another thing coming, because that Boglurker, getting hit by a Ransack represents, tremendously huge life swing, 12 points, the direction that you did not think was going to happen, right? Basically, consider how you play around Lightning Bolt. Don't play around Ransack all that much, because even the decks that do run it, I don't think run 3 copies. Yeah, and I would encourage you not to take this card in Arena. I think there are better options in Constructed, but Prophecy.deck is sort of a thing we're all playing against right now, at least. And expect to see a little bit of Ransack until something else comes along. Alright, we got purple cards. Most of these don't see play, so I don't need a... There's not a whole lot of commentary to be done here. Oops, sorry. But Faroon Defender, Orc, so, you know, this will see play in Orc decks, so keep that in mind if you're playing against a deck that is running Orcs. I actually think Faroon Defender is a pretty reasonable card that just sees no play. 1/4 Prophecy Guard can really put the hurt on aggro. If aggro becomes the meta, expect to see more of this card. The only deck I would imagine you actually see this card in is Warrior decks. That's purple and red. You're going to see this card in Orcs for sure, but I actually think that this card is one of the more defensive options and more playable defensive options that Warrior control decks or mid-range or ramp decks have. And I know there are people who are really trying to make those work. So if that's what you're playing against, expect Faroon Defenders. You know, you slap an equipment on this thing, you need to have an answer to it. Your best bet for answering it, honestly, is just slamming into it. It's not a card you need to worry about cracking back and killing you, for the most part. In those situations where you are worried about that, you're likely to be more worried about other prophecy cards that your opponent can trigger to kill you. Although, with 4 toughness, this is a card that you can't Crushing Blow. This is a card that you're going to feel awful about Lightning Bolting, so having a backup answer with, you know, as far as a guard or a lethal creature is something you should consider. If you think your opponent's playing this lethal creatures is probably the best way to answer it, especially, you know, even a Fighter's Guild recruit will survive combat with this thing, so. Frostbite Spider, I've never seen this played and constructed. I think it's a reasonable card. I just don't think it's got a place, it's got a home right now. Sorry about that. If you suspect your opponent of running Spider.deck, my only recommendation would be to hold on to support removals for the inevitable Spider's Lair, which is, you know, an interesting but dumpster tier card. Mummify. Mummify is a really difficult one to play around. There are no creatures that you're likely to be running. I mean, there are a couple, right? Like, I believe Nahagleaf can't be targeted by this. But other than that, there's not going to be a whole lot you can do about playing countering a Mummify with board position or anything like that. As far as playing around it goes, if you're the defensive deck, if you suspect your more aggressive opponent or your opponent pushing lethal of running Mummify, doubling up your guards is an important strategy in that respect. You know, this might be an instance where if your opponent has an empty lane and you suspect them of running Mummify, putting a double guard in the lane where they have any creatures at all is probably a sounder strategy than playing around haste creatures. Charge creatures. There's not a lot of overlap between creatures that have charge and creatures and decks that run Mummify. So I think that in the event that you're worried about getting blown out by Mummify, you should double up guards in lanes that your opponent has creatures. Other than that, Mummify is not... I mean, it doesn't see a ton of play. It sees playing Sorcerer, it sees playing Scout, some Scout decks. I'm not currently running it, but don't tell anyone because I want people to play around it still. I've seen it in some Spell Sword decks, although it's not a mainstay because they have so many other removal options. Mummify is a really good card, and it's difficult to come up with a lot of coherent strategies for playing around this. It is a almost exclusively defensive card, so it's only going to really screw you over while you're pushing lethal if they hit one of your creatures. It's worth pointing out, too, that that creature that they Mummify, if it hadn't attacked it, it's not going to get an attack as a Shriveled Mummy. The biggest thing I would worry about is mummifying your guard creatures and your opponent suddenly having lethal. If you're in a low life total and you suspect your opponent of playing Mummify, I would swing with your drain creatures first if you have that option. I would make every trade you needed to make first before swinging for damage, even if there are other compelling reasons why you would want to swing first. I would always make your trades first. That's about all you can do about that. Cursed Spectre, basically all of the same things I just said about Mummify apply to Cursed Spectre, except you should worry about it less. Cursed Spectre sees much less play. If you do see it being played by your opponent, I would be on the lookout for the 7/7 Deathlord, Imprisoned Deathlord that gets shackled whenever their opponent plays a creature, because I've only ever really seen this card played in combination with that for a, build your own faceless guy. Hearthstone reference. In Arena, you can play around this by swinging with your massive creatures that have abilities first. Midnight Sweep, this card sees quite a bit of play in Spell Sword. I have seen it occasionally played in those warrior decks that I was talking about. Playing around Midnight Sweep, there's a couple ways to do this. If you're pushing more damage than your opponent, if you're successfully racing your opponent, and you don't suspect your opponent of running a Firestorm that's going to blow you out, or a Dawn's Wrath, pile your creatures into one lane, minimize the effect that Midnight Sweep can have. Alternatively, it's worth pointing out that if your opponent has a lane full of creatures, and like say it's the Shadow lane, and you know that your opponent's running Midnight Sweep, and you're going to break a rune, keep in mind that when they play Midnight Sweep, they cannot sacrifice a creature to make room for the token that's created. So there is some argument to be made that you could make a calculation that this is the where I should put them because there's my creatures, because there's not going to be a guard creature showing up in that lane if I trigger Midnight Sweep, but that's such a niche situation, I wouldn't worry about it too much. By and large, same sort of things apply to this that have applied to previous cards. Hold on to your breakthrough attackers. It's a good way to continue pushing damage while also removing the Midnight Sweep creature that's created. And hold on to a Firebolt if that's the sort of thing you need to do. Lurking Mummy, I've never seen this played and constructed, although it's not an unreasonable card, it's just not real exciting. I would not expect to see this card in any deck except maybe the grindiest of decks. In the event that you're pushing lethal on your opponent as it hits a Lurking Mummy, not a lot of rule takes care of this. If you know your opponent's running it, you suspect they're running it, I think the best strategy is to hold on to a lethal creature if that's an option, or a charge creature with breakthrough that you can slap equipment on. These are some small situations, but it's the only time I can really imagine anybody being blown out by Lurking Mummy. In Arena, you can sort of combat this sort of thing by splitting your creatures into both lanes and just abandoning a lane, which is frequently the best strategy when you're racing in Arena. It's a mummy. I guess it used to be an undead, so. There is only one two-color card with Prophecy. It is Tyr. Tears doesn't see play in a lot of decks, not even Crusader decks, which I think it would benefit from. I think it's a good card. It's just solid. If you know your opponent's running Tyr, I mean, it is a legendary with Prophecy, so the chances of it hitting are so slim. But if you are looking for a strategy to combat the potential for your opponent having Tyr, it's got 4 toughness, so Lightning Bolt's an answer. I wouldn't actually stress about this card at all as far as racing goes. Same sort of things apply to all the other guard creatures. Split your creatures into different lanes if you're not going to get punished by a more likely event. Keep a removal spell or a charge creature with a weapon that you can throw on it, or keep a lethal creature. Finally, there are a number of neutral cards that have Prophecy. Lurking Crocodile sees playing some super aggressive decks that are really into punishing anybody who goes face because they want to race. You can play around this the exact same way you would play around Daring Cutverse. Spider Worker, I've never seen this played in constructed. Actually, that's not true. I have seen it played in constructed decks that run cards like Cool Firebloom, occasionally run Spider Worker. This is not a card you need to concern yourself with when it triggers as a Prophecy. Adoring Fan, I actually played against a guy who played this the other day. He was playing Control Mage, which actually makes a lot of sense as far as where you would put an Adoring Fan. Never worry about playing around Adoring Fan. Never worry about playing around Sparking Spider. Portcullis occasionally happens to the best of us in Arena. Portcullis actually is is different from the other guard creatures in that you should probably best combat this by throwing all of your creatures into one lane, so you can just break down the city gate. And finally, Dark Harvester. Not an unreasonable card. The Magicka cost on this is a little unfortunate, 7 Magicka. But I mean, this card can do serious work shutting down aggro. If you suspect your opponent of running Dark Harvester, there are a couple options. The same sort of things apply that have applied to previous guard creatures. Put your threats into separate lanes. If you've seen one already, calculate, if possible, a hit that will, a series of hits that will break the fewest runes until you can break that last rune for the final damage. Largely, though, I wouldn't worry about playing around Dark Harvester. It's a small enough roadblock that unless your opponent's playing some kind of combo deck and they need one more turn to win, there's not a lot you can do. It's sort of like Healing Potion in the sense that playing around a life gain card from your opponent is sort of an impossibility. You just need more damage, right? Which isn't exactly a strategy you can intentionally employ. So Anyway, alright, thanks for watching, guys. That is a look at every prophecy card in the game. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little bit something from it, and I hope you're having a great end of the season. Bye-bye.